In Asian languages, and probably ancient languages too, the word compassion included self-compassion. In modern terms, we think of compassion as for other people. We leave ourselves out of it. I think that's a big omission. So what would it take for you to be kind to yourself? Depends on what you need. And only you know what you really need.
There goes a sight from my soul.
Welcome to the Inspired Evolution. And it's an emotional treat to be back here today again with Dr. Daniel Goleman. Daniel, how are you today, sir?
Just fine, and it's a pleasure to be back on the show. Thanks.
It is such a treat for us to have you back. For those tuning in to Daniel for the first time, Dr. Goleman was on the show previously, so please do go check out that episode. That episode has gone gangbusters here on the Inspired Evolution. I don't think it has anything to do with me and my questions. I think it has a lot to do with the incredible work that Daniel continues to do in the world. If you'll bear with me just a sec, I'll do the honors. He's an internationally known psychologist, lectures frequently to professional groups, business audiences, and colleges, campuses around the world. And as a science journalist, he reported on the brain and behavioral sciences, and he wrote for the New York Times for many years. In 1995, believe it or not, that was 22 years ago, the Emotional Intelligence book was written and was on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year and a half. Currently has more than 5 million copies, and that was when this was submitted as a blurb. Probably since then, it's probably gone up even more in print
Probably.
worldwide. And it's been translated into 40 languages. It's been a bestseller in many countries, and he's written a number of books. All, like, I've read so many of them, and I know I've only scratched the surface. There is so much to go on. Topics include self-deception, creativity, transparency, meditation, social emotional learning, ecoliteracy, the ecological crisis. And there is so much depth and ground that we can cover when you're here, Daniel. Thank you so much for doing this with us here again today. Such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Daniel, last week we were speaking about emotional intelligence. We dived deep into your books. I guess somewhere I wanted to sort of start this time was to understand a little bit. Do you ever look back at your own life, to the Daniel that was, I don't know, maybe 10, 9, 8, 7, and go, I was always going to be this guy? Or is it really weird for you that you're this renowned author writing about these neurosciences and topics?
That's very interesting. So when I was a kid, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Do you ever look
Did I
at
have
yourself?
a glimmer of this? No, but my parents were, my father was a teacher of the humanities, and somehow the writing came maybe from his side. My mom was a social worker. And maybe the science part came from that. I have no idea. I think when I was 7, I didn't care. But when I was 8, I cared less. And when I was 9, I never thought about it. Yeah. So I can't create a line, a vector from there to here. Somehow it happened along the way.
Yeah. And so what was the key moment? Because I know you traveled to India at some point, to deepen your exploration into, I guess, the mind, but I guess I'm telling your story for you. I wonder what was the impetus that sort of shifted you onto your exploration of mind and behavior, and what sort of brought that all about?
Well, two things. One was that I had always been interested in psychology, and that's the profession I went into. But I also had an interest in meditation, particularly, as a kind of anxiety-ridden undergrad in college. I found it really helped cool me out and calm me down and help me be clearer. So that was my first motivation to get into it. And when I went to actually to Harvard in clinical psychology for graduate school, and it turned out that my fellowship included a year of travel and study abroad.
Yeah.
Well, when I found that out, I thought, wow, I'm going to India. I would like to see where the end point is for following this spiritual path. And so I did. And I had met Ram Dass. I don't know if your listeners know Ram Dass. He was a very important voice. He'd been as under the name Richard Alpert,
Yeah.
had been a psychedelic, Johnny Appleseed spreading the word. And then he had a kind of conversion. He went to India and he met this amazing yogi, Nimkroli Baba, and came back as Ram Dass and talked for years and years and years until his recent death. He talked about spiritual paths and spiritual evolution. And so I went to India to see, what's up with Nimkroli Baba and those kind of people. And I saw that they were, quantum leaps different than the people, say, I knew as the famous professors of psychology that I was studying with, back in the States. They had developed a different part of themselves that you never really heard about in psychology. And it had to do with the spiritual self. And they were lovely human beings. They were caring, they were present, they were not attached. They didn't want anything. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Think about that for a minute. Yeah.
That's a whole episode in itself. Just there.
I mean, the ones that I met who I think were the most evolved actually didn't care if anybody knew they were evolved. They didn't want followers. They didn't want fame. They didn't want money. It was remarkable compared to the value structure of the modern world. It was a complete turnaround.
I love the way that you use the word "the modern world" because I think oftentimes we sort of conflate certain ideologies with the West versus the East. But I think even like maybe it's just what's happened over the ages. Development has come to all sorts of parts of the world, and things in India, I know, being Indian, I guess lots is changing over there at the moment as well. But there is still this real spiritual.
Interesting.
Yeah,
here's how I see that history evolving. I think that these ideas spread widely. I think indigenous peoples have them in their own way.
Yeah.
The early desert fathers in Christianity were very much like yogis in the Himalayas today. But I think what happened was that the institutionalization of religion in Europe particularly squelched the spiritual path, seeing it as heretical because it needed no intervention by the church or any institution between the person and the spirit. It was direct, it's your experience. And what do you do with all these priests and so on who are running around? They need to work too. So it became heresy. And I think in what we now think of as the East, particularly in Sufism and among yogis in India and certainly in Tibet and China and those cultures, they had a different attitude. They saw value in supporting people who would devote their lives to spiritual development. I know that when I would be with Nimkroli Baba in India or with other saints, there was an understanding in that culture of what's called darshan, which is just being with, because there's something in the presence. In fact, the Tibetan word for the Dalai Lama is not the Dalai Lama. It translates as the presence. Because when you're with the being like that, you get a contact high, basically. It's kind of contagious.
Yeah, and we tapped into the contagious nature of emotions in our last episode about emotional intelligence and how cultivate. One of the big takeaways actually from the last episode, if I can pay homage to it, was one of them for me is I'm going to butcher it, but it was more the more stable individual emotionally actually has the influence in an interaction over the other, which has been huge for me in my walk going forward. Especially as a coach and making sure that like I'm coming from a really well grounded place. And I will, talking about grounded, there's a whole new punchline, which is grounded body, open heart, and clear mind, which is tagline to your new book, Why We Meditate. But before we start diving into some of that work, there's an itch that wants to be scratched in this conversation around the sort of the dance between spirituality and psychology. I think you mentioned Ram Dass, and he was obviously a well-renowned psychologist as well, not too unlike yourself. And at a certain point, not everybody makes the bridge, but not everybody makes the jump. But there seems to be this dance between psychology and spirituality, psychology and spirituality. And when I look from the outside looking in, psychology seems to be much more about the nature of the mind and how we sort of approach it, whereas spirituality seems much more etheric and the nature of the spirit. Do you think how your awareness and your thoughts on this?
So
are they dipoles, or do they come together? Like, is it a natural evolution that they come together, or is it potentially that some of the best after a while working with the mind, you realize that spirituality is something that you need to come home to? I'm sorry, I'm pre-programming the answer. I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, actually, my own experience tracked that evolution quite a bit. When I was studying psychology in graduate school, you would never think about anything spiritual. That was totally taboo. It goes back to a famous passage from Sigmund Freud, where he was in correspondence with a famous Nobel laureate poet named Roland. I'm butchering his name anyway. Around the turn of the 19th century, and this poet said he was a student of a famous Indian mystic, Ramakrishna, and he said, "I have an experience where I transcend myself," and he describes it to Freud, and Freud writes back, I looked into my own mind, I find nothing like that, and I think we have to dismiss it. And it was kind of taboo in psychology for a century afterward. However, since then, I think many psychologists themselves have found, for example, mindfulness is very helpful, and that's a spiritual practice, although it can be done in a kind of secular way. And I think that now there's more and more melding among certain psychologists, not by any means the mainstream, of a spiritual path. But when I've talked to the Dalai Lama about this, he says, psychology and modern psychology is kind of kindergarten level. It doesn't know anything about the subtle body. It doesn't know anything about how the mind and spirit can evolve beyond the limits that it studies. So there's a body of mainstream psychology which is very limited from a spiritual point of view and dismisses the spirit. And then there are psychologists and psychologies that try to bring in the spiritual dimension. And I think the Dalai Lama is right that there are many, many practices and, in fact, methodologies that help people get to higher levels of consciousness that are unknown in psychology. That's my assessment.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And what is the pull to higher levels of consciousness? What's awaiting for us in those spaces?
Well, if I go back to what the yogis were like that I met in India, the Tibetan lamas or the Sufis and so on, it's a way of being which is anxiety-free, which is not driven by desire and anger and hatred, which is free of those kind of earthly pulls, and which is very loving, very compassionate, very present, and probably very blissful. I think it's intrinsically rewarding because it feels good.
So that brings me home to one of the questions that I've got is why we meditate. You recently wrote a book with Rinpoche, and I think Rinpoche is a salutation, but I didn't note down his name.
His name is Sokni Rinpoche,
Sokni.
the Tibetan name. Rinpoche is an honorific. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's a yeah. Um, so how did so you mentioned India, and I know Tibetan lots of Tibetan lamas get trained up in India, and that's where there's
Mm,
formal schooling. Sorry, for formal in
yeah.
apostrophes occurs. But yeah, how did you? What was the impetus for writing Why We Meditate? Let's start there.
Sure. Well, I've been studying with Tibetan lamas. It's an evolution. I started with yogis, and then I evolved to Vipassana meditation,
Hmm.
and then from there I went into Tibetan practice. And Sokni comes from a very wonderful family that goes back generations,
Mm,
who are all meditation masters.
yeah.
And he has four brothers, the three of whom are very active now as meditation teachers: Chogyam Rinpoche, Mingyur Rinpoche, and then Sokni Rinpoche. I've studied with all of them.
Mm,
And Sokni is also a longtime friend.
hmm.
And so I was at a retreat with Sokni, and I gave a talk on a book I'd written about the science of meditation called Altered Traits, kind of a
Mm.
review of all of the best science. And I gave a talk on it, and he said, my Asian students would be really interested. Let's write something for them. That evolved in this book, which is now
Mm.
translated into all kinds of languages. So we didn't really plan on the book in a kind of linear way. It just kind of evolved. And my
Blossomed.
own, if you ask me, why do you meditate? The answer would be different. For example,
Mm.
when I did as I said, my initial interest was because it helped me with my anxiety. Then I got very interested during my Vipassana years in kind of really amazing altered states, very
Hmm.
blissful states and so on, which I saw eventually as a dead end. And then I went into Tibetan practice, and I've been working on that since.
Mm. Can you? I think that'd be quite interesting for some people to tune into because um, Vipassana is quite a incredible time away to disconnect and well reconnect to other parts.
Mm, mm.
Um, and yeah, you mentioned the word dead end, and maybe that's a heavy-handed term, or maybe it's not. Can you describe what you meant by
Oh yeah,
Vipassana
I
providing
don't.
you
I,
that?
do, I'd like to delete that
No, but what
and
did you? What
say
did you? Yeah, what
for
like?
me it was the dead end for me was the fascination with states
Mm,
that you might get into on a Vipassana retreat.
mm,
So the standard setup for a Vipassana retreat is that you take 10 days out of your life
mm-hmm,
and you very intensively begin to work with your mind.
mm-hmm,
And you see that the thoughts that were your preoccupations before you took the retreat are actually distractions.
mm,
And that if you let them come and let them go and stay with what's left, it gets more and more interesting. And in fact, that's a complete path in itself. It ends up in what
mm-hmm,
they call a nibbonic state. So it's not a dead end in that sense. Well,
mm-hmm,
but I kind of got stalled along the way because I kept experiencing states of mind that I found very, very pleasant.
mm,
And I didn't want to go any further. So, but then in the Tibetan path, I saw that it leads to kind of an admirable mode of being, which I talked to you about. And
mm,
there were many Tibetan lamas who thought, oh, I thought, gee, when I grow up, I'd like to be like that.
mm-hmm.
So I started doing those practices, and it was an easy segue from one to the other,
Yeah.
frankly. Yeah.
I love what you're describing there because you followed your inspiration into your evolution, and obviously, inspired evolution is the whole vibe
Oh
around
yeah.
here.
Yeah. There you go.
And yeah, so what is yeah, I obviously we could start by discussing what was your inspirations about like having read the book. I know openness is a is a whole massive concept unto itself. Can I start there, or is that too nebulous to
Well,
start?
start wherever you want. It's a little advanced, but that's great. Go ahead.
Yeah, how do was it the openness that drew you in of these leaders, and then then I'll ask you how we cultivate that in our own life. Yep.
I think it was the whiff of openness. That is the experience of what a person who lived in that spaciousness was like that got me very interested. So I met many Tibetan Lamas who live in an internal openness. And openness means you're not confined. And one of the things that confines us is our thoughts. A stream of thought. We get interested in this, and then that leads to the other thing, and that goes on to the other thing. And we lead our lives following one mind stream after another. And in openness, you let them come and you let them go. And it creates a kind of spaciousness inside that's not, you could say, trapped by these streams of thought.
And so how do we approach openness? Are there practices that the Lamas espouse? Yeah, what is
Well, yes, and some will introduce an experience of openness right away. Others will take you through a more methodical set of steps to cultivate the ability to, for example, focus and concentrate and let those distractions go, and to use that then to stabilize in a state that's very open but doesn't have a target like the breath. You might use the breath at the start. And then you go from there to a kind of, what shall I say, a greater openness or lesser openness, more open openness. You know, when you get into these experiences of what's called the non-dual, actually it's beyond language. So it's very hard to put words to what these experiences are.
What do some of the practical, is it exercises that we do? What do some of the practical exercises look like?
Sogni starts with one that I really like. It's called Drop It. Because right now, my mind.
I love his humor, by the way. Sorry
mind,
to interject, but I love his humor, by the way.
Yeah, I know. He loves to laugh. So drop it.
Drop it.
Assumes that we're caught in something, some stream of thought. And drop it is just an exercise in letting it go. And you take your hands and put them in the air, and then you exhale, and as you exhale, you drop it, whatever it was. And the mantra of drop it is, who cares? What happens, happens. So you just go, exhale. And it turns out that interrupts your train of thought. So that's a first taste of one of these more open states, because what you've just done is to let whatever your internal fascination was go. So that's a beginning. Yeah.
So it's like a pattern interrupt. Are you visualizing that you're actually holding on to the thought as you're dropping it, or that's just a physiological, just let it go?
It's just a physiological. You've talked about mind, body, spirit. This is the body part of dropping it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, when you slap your knees as you do it, and it interrupts your train of thought. It's that simple.
Yeah. I love that. And is most of it, and so that's interrupting our pattern of thought and just allowing ourselves to drop what emerges.
Well, it gives you a moment of not having anything occupy your mind.
At the risk of tuning into some of the thoughts of those that might be listening in, and then you drop it, and then another thought emerges, and then you drop it, and then another thought emerges. Can you take us deeper? Yeah.
Well, then you might go on to, for example, following your breath, or to a breath control exercise, and these are the Tibetans have used some that you find in yoga, the yoga that's very popular, pranayama style. exercises. One that they like a lot is what's called the vase breath, where you breathe very deeply into your belly and you hold it. And actually, there's now a lot of scientific research showing that if you do this, if you breathe in as much as deeply as you can, letting your belly swell out, and hold it for as long as you can, and exhale for as long as you can. When I say long as you can, I mean comfortably. If you do that 4 times, it shifts your physiology from kind of the sympathetic nervous system state that we live in too much of the time, to a more laid back, what's called a parasympathetic nervous system response. It's a recovery mode. And it's a quick way to get out of a stress spiral that you might be in. So that's another exercise that Sokni Rinpoche talks about in the book. And in the book, by the way, we go through these exercises and the rationale for them from a Tibetan point of view, and then I come in with like a scientific angle, like I just did on the breath. So he goes through many such a whole progression of these exercises in the book, including, for example, on compassion. Meditating on someone else's suffering and trying to share with them your good feeling. As you were saying earlier, for example, in coaching, if you're stable in a positive state and the person you're coaching is wrought up or stressed out, you can help them calm down because emotions are contagious. And there is a compassion exercise where you take on in your own mind the person's pain or suffering, and you give them your own stability, your own even-handedness about it, a better state, and you do that repeatedly with each breath. And it helps the person, I think, because of this contagion effect you were talking about. And it helps you too, actually, because you've gotten in that state. So compassion, there's a large literature now in science on compassion and the benefits of compassion. It turns out, surprise, it makes people more generous. It makes them more compassionate, makes them more likely to help someone in need. And that was always the claim, in spiritual traditions. And now, guess what? Science has found out.
It's catching up.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's an interesting dance there between, and I would love to get your thoughts on, at the risk of turning you into a dictionary for a second, sympathy, empathy, and compassion.
Sure.
I think the three often get interchanged in dialogue and language, but over time, having been on, I want to say a bit of a path, but that would be dishonoring the path. This inspired evolution path has been very wide, very open, and really incredible for me personally. And so in there, I've had to come to learn that there is actually subtle differences between those three things: sympathy, empathy, and compassion. I'd love to get your thoughts on the differences between what each of those terms mean to you. Yeah.
Let me tell you a story.
Yes, please.
That will explain this.
I love it.
This was an actual experiment that was done at the Princeton Theological Seminary with students who are studying to be preachers, basically. And half of them were given the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who stopped to help a stranger in need by the side of the road. The other half were given random Bible topics. And then they're told that they should go one by one over to another building where they'll give the practice sermon and be evaluated on it. And as each of them goes from one building to another, they pass a guy who's bent over and moaning in pain. So the question is, do they have sympathy, empathy, or compassion for this guy? And it turns out that if you're thinking about the Good Samaritan, it didn't make any difference. It was whether you thought you were late that determined.
So what you were ruminating on had no effect.
No, had no effect. But you might feel some sympathy, like, oh, that poor guy. Empathy is deeper. Empathy means you tune into the suffering of the person. Like he's bent over, he must have a stomach problem. Compassion means you stop and you do something. So there's a spectrum there that goes from sympathy, which is kind of very surface, to empathy, which is a deeper feeling with, to compassion, which is feeling strongly enough about the person's suffering that you're going to do something.
Can I take this deeper? So there's a person drowning in the water, and let's see if this metaphor helps me delineate where I'm trying to go. So there's a person drowning in the water and I'm on the docks. If I'm sympathizing with that person, from what I'm hearing, I can see their pain and I can acknowledge it for myself because I'm sympathizing. If I'm empathetic in that position, what am I doing in that situation? Am I feeling like potentially...
So if you're sympathetic, yeah, it's interesting. So you might say, oh, that poor guy, if you're sympathetic.
Yeah.
If you're empathetic, you'd say, you'd be much more upset. You would be feeling his pain or panic.
While standing on the dock.
Yeah.
While standing on the
Now,
dock.
I have to ask you a question. Are you a good swimmer or not?
I'm
You didn't
okay.
say.
I'm okay.
Yeah. Is there an inner
not
tube
Michael
around?
Phelps.
So then compassion, you have to be compassionate for yourself as well as the other person. So would you jump in to help that person depends on whether you have the skill to help the person. If you have the chops, the swimming ability, or you have an inner tube, or you have something that you could bring to the person. That would be taking compassionate action.
I love that. Thank you so much. That really helps me understand it better. So sympathy is I can feel for that person. Empathy is I'm feeling what they're feeling in that situation. And then, the compassion. And I love the bit that I love about the metaphor we just unpacked is that compassion comes in many forms. It could be the tube. It could be me swimming out. It could be me finding help for someone that could swim out to that person. Yeah.
What are your resources? That's the question. What can you bring to that person?
And so compassion is a it's interesting because spiritually it consistently comes up again and again and again. But for those that are tuning in, and I'll put my hand up as myself included, like I've started approaching this work, but it can be quite intimidating to think about the state of the world sometimes and how much need there is out there. And then, okay, I'm going to bring my compassion to what? Like, wow.
Well, it's
feels like a
interesting.
tall order. Yeah.
So I asked the Dalai Lama about this. I did a book with the Dalai Lama called The Force for Good, which was about his vision for the world. I said, each of us has a very different sphere of influence, and we can only do so much, or maybe we can do a lot, depending on who we are. And he said something really interesting. He said, everybody can influence somebody else. Everybody has a sphere, your family, your friends. If you have a podcast, it's your listeners. If you're a politician, maybe it's in setting policy. If you're a wealthy person, then it has to do with what you can do with your money. He said, think about what your sphere is and what you can do that will actually help, and do that now, even if you won't live to see the fruit of that, which I thought was interesting. In other words, it's not for gratification for you, but rather because it will benefit either right now or tomorrow or eventually other people. And he said, and don't care about that part. Just do what you can. Do whatever you can, and it's different for each of us. Don't feel you're going to solve all the problems. They're enormous.
Yeah. I really resonate with what you're saying because at the moment, it's colliding a couple of things within me personally. I'm reading a book called Die Wise by Stephen Jenkinson, and one of these, he's a writer, but he's a poet in some ways as well, I would say, even more so than writers are poets. But he talks about one of the meditations or contemplations he's got me going on is the idea of a quark, where the light has the star itself has potentially passed away, but its light is still traveling towards us. And we're here and we're experiencing the light of that star, which is no longer there in the present moment, according to the science, yet its light is still traveling tens of thousands, millions of years into travel to us to be able to witness it and see its light. And it's been a profound contemplation, and not too dissimilar to what you've just described, in that our time here on Earth is potentially limited. Well, not potentially. It's
It is limited. Yeah,
you're right. It is limited.
We all have an expiration date.
Depending on how science goes these days, I don't know. They're trying. Longevity's going a lot. They're really battling that longevity frontier at the moment. It seems.
Count on it.
Yeah. Some of the harebrained stuff I've heard recently. Well, not harebrained, but some of the really interesting stuff I would say that makes my hair stand on end is maybe they're discussing like it's turning from oxygen-based species to nitrogen-based species. And I was like, what are we doing?
Wow.
But okay. But I've totally digressed. In that, that light is still traveling to you, but the light, the star itself is gone. And it invites the contemplation that you will surely be gone at some point. Yet the trace of you having been here, the light that you've left behind, touch wood, what are the what is that imprint that you've left in some way? And that's what I'm hearing from you as well is and you've written a whole book on social intelligence. The compassion piece in terms of the legacy that we leave is really the kindness that we leave behind, would you say?
Oh, that's very beautifully put, and I think that's exactly the Dalai Lama's point too, that each of us can have lasting influence. It'd be different for each one of us, but that can be our legacy. That can be what we leave behind once we go. Whatever we began might continue. Exactly.
At the risk of changing gears too rapidly, too fast, you coach a lot of leaders and you speak to a lot of leaders, and success is this conversation that people are regularly now, especially in my circles, asking people to redefine. Due to the nature of the world, like infinite growth on a finite planet with resources can be, please redefine your success and your KPIs. Can't believe we went from compassion to KPIs, but we're doing it. But in that space, do you help reorient leaders from what they're currently defining as their success? And how do you espouse values and virtues such as compassion into that space when it's not what's currently socially programmed into them?
I'm writing a book on a kind of a wrap-up look at emotional intelligence. There's a lot of research on it now. And one of the surprises is that a leader who is caring actually is more compelling, engages people more, motivates them better, gets them to perform better than the leader who is driven by competitiveness. I have a friend who coaches C-suite executives, and she says every one of them is there because they were driven over the course of their career. They had to achieve their goals. But once they get into a leadership position, if they don't temper that with empathy and caring, they're going to be an awful leader. They're not going to be a leader you want to be led by. Consider leaders you've loved versus bosses you've hated. And the ones, I've asked this around the world actually in talks I've given, tell me about leaders you loved and leaders you hated. And the leaders people love are, among other things, compassionate and caring. And the ones they hated are distant, competitive, judgmental, critical. And I think, sadly, the reason that those leaders they hate are like that is because they beat themselves up in the same way. Too often, that's how they got to where they are. by having this kind of perfectionist standard that it's never good enough. And so they only see what's wrong with how they did and drive themselves to get better. And then when they become leaders, they lead in the same way. They see what people did wrong, but they don't see what they're doing right. And that's very demotivating.
Does that start at an early age when potentially, and it's probably not the root of all of it, but maybe when parents can be critical of their children to sort of.
Well, here's an interesting question. Think about the difference between coming home to parents who say, "How'd you do on the test?" or versus parents who say, "Who were you kind to today?" It's a totally different way of thinking about it. Totally different. And the kid, sadly, most of us, who has parents who are only interested in how well you do in school, not how you did socially, or, who are you a popular kid because you're nice to other kids, you're kind to other kids. If parents continually only ask about achievement, then you can see how that might lead to a leader who is achievement driven. Absolutely.
And the invitation is not necessarily to surrender achievement, but to temper it with care and love and empathy and compassion. Is that correct?
I think so. It's not that you don't care about your child doing well in school. You want them to learn too, but you're cultivating another side of them, of their being at the same time.
Yeah, I speak from experience, having looked at some of this work myself recently, and going from KPIs to self-love now. Thank you. I love these conversations with you. The concept of self-love it's a whole spiritual calling, and it can be so deep, so profound, but I also find it can be quite nebulous to even where to begin with self-love. For me personally, maybe I've just got too analytical a mind, being trained as an engineer and being achievement-oriented. So to unpack that, recently I started working on kindness for others. And that sounds like compassion. Is like, can I just, and I love the way you describe it, like, who was I kind to today, And I have this little fun experiment that I've sort of played a game with myself, which is like I try to collect 14 thank yous every day. And then that way I've done something for someone if they said thank you.
I like that.
Sometimes I don't hit the number 14 though, and I find little hacks, which is like I'll go to the shops and I'll buy something. And I was like, thank you for the purchase. But we won't talk about that here while everybody's listening, okay? But it's a metric to hit. So I've got my KPIs for kindness. And in there I found that, that went a reasonable amount of the way, and it definitely buoyed me through certain parts of my journey. And then becoming a father, having, sleep deprivation being a part of my journey, and, like a lot of stuff came up. Parenting is an incredible personal development school in itself. In there I found that actually when I was in my downtime, in my spaces, when I wasn't out hunting for my thank yous, I found myself quite cold at times when I felt I was depleted of resources internally. And I realized I was responding to everybody with the same way that I talked to myself. And this was a huge realization for me, which was, and the nugget of it was, I'm only as kind to others as I am kind to myself at the heart of it. And so I started with this big concept of self-love, and then it sort of came down to kindness, to collect gratitude from, my actions in the outer world. And now it's come home to this closer to, actually, can I exercise kindness to myself? And that seemed to be bringing me closer. And recently, it's just rested on this word, which is gentleness, which I'm just trying to be more gentle on myself instead of me, picking up something and dropping it and going, oh man, come on, you're better than that, you dropped it, and just that subtle shift, and recognizing that actually I'm reprogramming myself again and again with gentleness, by approaching it slightly differently with that intention, then I can actually, when something happens out externally, I respond with greater gentleness outside because I've rewired myself. Your
Right.
thoughts on this?
Well, think about this. There's the self that is self-critical, and it says, oh, I only got 12 thank yous. I need 2 more. Whatever your personal KPI might be. Yeah. So think how different it would be if the part of your mind that sees what, quote, you did wrong, didn't see it as wrong, but saw it as funny, like laughed about it. Yeah. One of the things I've noticed about all of these amazing beings that I was with in Asia was they laugh a lot. And they laugh about themselves particularly. So being able to laugh at yourself means that you, on the one hand, have a little distance. You're not caught in what it was. And the other is that you can spin it in a way where it gives you pleasure instead of, a kick in the pants or whatever it was. So that's a form of self-love. In Asian languages, and probably ancient languages too, the word compassion included self-compassion. In modern terms, we think of compassion as for other people. We leave ourselves out of it. I think that's a big omission. So what would it take for you to be kind to yourself? Maybe getting more sleep, for example. You mentioned sleep deprivation. So why don't you, give yourself the pleasure of a nap? That's a form of self-love. That's a form of self-compassion. It depends on what you need. And only you know what you really need.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I love the humor piece because I was watching, I heard Sogni say somewhere in the close of one of his speeches, incredible talk. And on the back of it, the talk was, okay, any parting words, Sogni Rinpoche, and don't lose your humor.
Exactly.
And I couldn't get over it. I was like, that was a really profound 90 minutes. And then at the end, he espoused humor like you're referring to now.
He's actually one of the funniest people I know, Sogni Rinpoche. When you're hanging out with him, constantly joking around, constantly. Yeah. And I think that lightness is really a not just a good thing for us. I think it's a sign of a deeper evolution too.
I think it's interesting because on some level people associate, and this is me leaning back into the C-suite exec space, take seriousness to mean maturity. And yet in spiritual maturity, what I'm hearing you say is humor is actually a big telltale sign.
I think that an executive needs to be serious about the things that matter in that context. If they take that home and they're serious that way with everybody in their lives, that's a problem. So I think seriousness has its place, has its reasons, but lightness as a way of being is definitely much better. So you don't want to be an executive joking about the things that matter in that context, but you don't want to be that executive seriousness all the time everywhere. You need the flexibility, don't you think?
The range. Yeah, I love it. I totally agree. Totally agree. So why we meditate? So we've scratched some of the surface here in terms of there is openness as a whole body of work, compassion as a whole body of work. Thank you so much. And then also this lightness that you're referring to as well. And it's profound because the practices you've described, even that you gave on this episode, they're quite simple places to enter such deep and I want to use the word intriguing, but inspiring is probably the right word. Inspiring states and character traits that you could cultivate within yourself that would help you navigate your life so much better. Why we meditate? Grounded body, open heart, clear mind. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about why that phrase came about? Grounded body, open heart, clear mind.
Well, I think that those are the three dimensions that these practices work in. And I would recommend not just the book, Why We Meditate, but certainly Rinpoche made a series of videos where he demonstrates each of his methods for anybody. You don't have to be Tibetan, you don't have to be anything to benefit from these practices. And some of them deal with what in his context is called the subtle body. It's a kind of an energetic body that many practitioners in the West deal with, but is not recognized in certainly in mainstream psychology, but it makes a big difference. So for example, if you do, for example, Tai Chi, you're working with that dimension of the body. If you do yoga, you are. So there's the body part, and then give me the three again, because I can't remember.
Grounded body, open heart, clear mind.
Open heart is all about compassion for yourself as well as the people around you or the people you run into. And then clear mind, I think, is the ultimate goal, which is to not have...
Hey, you there, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into this incredible conversation on compassionate leadership with Dr. Daniel Goleman. The internet dropped out just at the very last little minute there, and Dr. Daniel Goleman had another appointment to attend to. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Daniel Goleman again and again. His books have been incredible game changers for me on my journey, Altered Traits and Emotional Intelligence being seminal in my journey. And also he's recently written Why We Meditate. I'll put links to the Rinpoche's videos that Dr. Daniel Goleman was referring to in the show notes below, along with a link to Why We Meditate if you guys want to check that out further. And I want to take this opportunity, Dr. Daniel Goleman, hopefully you're watching the replay. Thank you so much again for your time, your energy, your wisdom, your guidance. All the work you've put into this work, 22 years ago, you wrote Emotional Intelligence, but your journey on this path started even long before then. So I just really want to take this opportunity to thank you so much. And as always, Inspired Evolution Tribe, the depth at which you're excited to just inspire your evolution and be here and show up and tune into these episodes. Man, you guys humble me. Thank you so much for your presence, a topic we covered deeply in this conversation, and being here and tuning in and staying inspired to keep evolving. Big love, y'all. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, leave us a comment. And if you want to stay in tune for new episodes launching every Monday, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay inspired to evolve.